The crack of a rifle shot echoed through the dusty main street of Willow Creek, Montana, drawing gasps from passers-by as Grace Adams clutched her 6-month-old son closer to her chest and ducked behind a water trough. It was 1876, and the frontier town had grown increasingly hostile toward the young widow, or so everyone believed her to be since she'd arrived 3 months earlier with a baby and no husband in sight. There she is, the fallen woman with her bastard child, shouted Elmer Jenkins, the town's most notorious drunk, as he staggered down the boardwalk, thankfully too intoxicated to aim properly. His shot had gone wide, splintering the sign above the general store. Grace trembled, her heart pounding as she protected little Samuel with her body. The 20-year-old woman had endured the whispers, the cold shoulders, and the outright insults since arriving in Willow Creek, but this was the first time someone had fired a weapon in her direction. "That's enough, Jenkins." Sheriff Thompson emerged from his office, looking more annoyed than concerned. "Put that rifle down before you hurt someone who matters." The implication that Grace and her child didn't matter stung worse than the threat of violence. Tears threatened to spill from her hazel eyes as she remained crouched behind the trough, whispering soothing words to her frightened baby. "That woman's presence is an affront to decent folk," spat Mrs. Perkins from the doorway of her millinery shop. "Coming here with a fatherless child, refusing to name the man who dishonored her." Grace bit her lip. How could she explain that she'd been married legally and properly to Samuel's father? That the man she loved had promised to follow her west after settling his affairs back east? That the last letter she'd received from him had been 6 months ago, just before Samuel was born? "Stand aside, folks." A deep voice cut through the crowd's murmurs. The townspeople parted as a tall, broad-shouldered man strode toward the scene. Flynn Grayson was Willow Creek's most successful rancher, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his fearsome skill with both gun and fists. His dark blonde hair was sun-streaked, his face weathered from years under the Montana sky, and at 32 he commanded respect wherever he went. "Mr. Jenkins," Flynn said calmly, "I believe you dropped something." He nodded toward the rifle that Sheriff Thompson had wrested from the drunk's hands. "That woman," Jenkins began. "That woman," Flynn interrupted, "is none of your concern." His voice remained level, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. Flynn turned toward Grace, who still huddled behind the trough. He approached slowly, then crouched down beside her. "Are you hurt, madam?" Grace shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Samuel whimpered in her arms, and the little one. Flynn's expression softened as he looked at the baby. "He's frightened, but unharmed," Grace managed to whisper. Flynn nodded, then straightened to his full height, facing the gathered crowd. "I've stood by long enough. This stops today." Sheriff Thompson scoffed. "Flynn, I know you've got a soft spot for strays, but this isn't your business." "It is now," Flynn's voice carried across the street. "That child bears my name." A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Grace stared up at him in confusion. "The boy is mine," Flynn continued, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces. "And Mrs. Adams is under my protection." Grace's confusion deepened. She had never spoken more than a few words to Flynn Grayson since arriving in town. Why would he claim her son, a child he had never seen until today? "You expect us to believe you fathered that child?" Mrs. Perkins challenged, her thin face pinched with suspicion. "I don't much care what you believe, Harriet," Flynn replied coolly, "but I'd advise against calling my son names in the future." He turned back to Grace and offered his hand. "Mrs. Adams, I think it's time I took you and our boy home." Grace hesitated, utterly bewildered by this strange turn of events. But with the hostile faces surrounding them and no better option presenting itself, she tentatively placed her hand in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. "My things," she began. "I'll send someone for them," Flynn assured her, guiding her toward a handsome wagon parked nearby. "Right now, let's get you both safely away from here." As Flynn helped her into the wagon, Grace caught sight of Jenkins muttering to Sheriff Thompson, who was watching them with narrowed eyes. She knew this wasn't the end of it, but for the moment, she was grateful for the unexpected rescue. Flynn climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a gentle flick, set the horses in motion. They rode in silence until the town was well behind them. "Mr. Grayson," Grace finally said, "I don't understand why you did that. Samuel is not your son." Flynn kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "No, he's not, but those people back there don't need to know that." "But why would you? I've watched how they've treated you these past months," he interrupted. "It isn't right." Grace studied his profile, trying to decipher his motivation. "I'm grateful, truly. But claiming to be Samuel's father, that's a serious matter." Flynn glanced at her, then at the baby who had fallen asleep in her arms. "It seemed the quickest way to stop what was happening, unless you'd prefer I take you back." "No," Grace said quickly, "but where are we going?" "My ranch, the Double G. It's about an hour's ride from town." He paused. "You'll be safe there while we figure out what comes next." Grace wasn't sure what to think. Flynn Grayson was essentially a stranger, yet he had just appended his reputation to protect her and Samuel. As the wagon rumbled over the rutted trail, she wondered what price this unexpected kindness might ultimately carry. The Double G Ranch sprawled across a verdant valley nestled between rolling hills. A two-story farmhouse stood proudly in the center of the property, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and grazing land that seemed to stretch to the horizon. As they approached, Grace could see several men working with cattle in the distance. "It's beautiful," she murmured, genuinely impressed by the evident prosperity of Flynn's operation. "Been building it for 10 years, Flynn replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Started with nothing but 50 acres and 3 skinny cows." He guided the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "It's not much compared to what you might be used to back east, but it's magnificent," Grace assured him. After 3 months in a cramped room above the laundry where she worked, the ranch house looked like a palace. Flynn helped her down from the wagon, careful not to disturb Samuel, who still slept peacefully. "Mrs. Grayson, my mother, lives here too," he explained. "She'll be happy for the company. She's been after me to find a wife for years." Grace tensed. "Mr. Grayson, if you think that I don't think anything of the sort," Flynn quickly reassured her. "This arrangement is temporary just until we can sort out a better solution. But for now, as far as anyone knows, you're my wife who's been living back east until recently." The front door opened before Grace could respond, and an elegant older woman emerged onto the porch. Frances Grayson had the same striking blue eyes as her son, though her once blonde hair had silvered with age. She was dressed simply but well, and her curious gaze immediately settled on Grace and the baby. "Flynn," she called. "You've brought visitors?" Flynn guided Grace forward. "Mother, this is Grace Adams and her son Samuel." He took a deep breath. "There's been some trouble in town. I've told everyone that Samuel is my son and Grace is under my protection." Frances's eyebrows shot up, but to her credit, she recovered quickly. "I see." She descended the steps and approached Grace with a warm smile. "You poor dear, you must be exhausted. Come inside, both of you." Grace followed Frances into the house, marveling at the comfortable furnishings and tasteful decor. It wasn't ostentatious, but it spoke of care and prosperity so different from the harsh living conditions she'd endured since arriving in Montana. "Flynn, show Mrs. Adams to the blue room," Frances directed. "I'll have Consuela prepare something to eat." As Flynn led her upstairs, Grace finally found her voice again. "Your mother seems very accommodating," Flynn chuckled softly. "Mother's seen enough of life not to be easily shocked. And she's wanted grandchildren for so long, I suspect she's willing to overlook the unusual circumstances. But this deception is necessary for now," Flynn finished firmly. "Here's your room." He opened a door to reveal a spacious bedroom decorated in shades of blue and cream. There's a connecting door to a smaller room that can serve as a nursery. Grace stepped inside, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. This morning, she had been a despised outcast. Now she was supposedly the wife of one of the most respected men in the territory. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, turning to face him. Flynn leaned against the doorframe, considering his answer. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be judged unfairly. Rest now. We'll talk more at supper." After he left, Grace laid Samuel in the center of the large bed and sat beside him, stroking his soft brown hair. "What have we gotten ourselves into, little one?" she whispered. Samuel merely yawned in response, content in a way he hadn't been in their cramped quarters in town. Grace sighed, knowing that no matter how luxurious their surroundings, they were still living a lie, one that could collapse at any moment. The next few days passed in a blur of adjustment. Frances proved to be a gracious hostess, showing Grace around the house and grounds, cooing over Samuel, and never once pressing for details about their supposed relationship with Flynn. Consuela, the Mexican cook who had been with the Graysons for years, taught Grace how to prepare several of Flynn's favorite dishes. Chattering away in a mix of Spanish and English, Flynn himself was often absent during daylight hours, tending to the ranch's extensive operations. When their paths did cross, he was unfailingly polite but maintained a careful distance. Grace wasn't sure if she was relieved or disappointed by his reserve. On the fourth evening, as Grace sat on the front porch rocking Samuel to sleep, Flynn joined her. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting a golden glow over the land. "Your boy seems to be thriving here," Flynn observed, settling into a chair beside her. "He is," Grace agreed. "I've never seen him so content." Flynn nodded, seemingly pleased. "Mother's besotted with him. I think she's knitted 3 new blankets already." Grace smiled. "She's been very kind, you both have." She paused, gathering her courage. "But Mr. Grayson, Flynn," he corrected gently, "if we're supposed to be married, you should probably use my given name." "Flynn," she amended. "This can't continue indefinitely. I'm grateful for your protection, but I can't impose on your hospitality forever. And what about your reputation? Surely claiming a child out of wedlock will have consequences." Flynn shrugged. "My reputation can withstand a few rumors. As for the rest," he hesitated. "I've been thinking, the foreman's cabin by the east pasture is empty. It's small, but it would give you and Samuel your own place while still keeping you under the ranch's protection." "You do that?" Grace asked, surprised by his continued generosity. "I would." Flynn's gaze was steady. "But there's something I need to know first. Where is Samuel's father, the real one?" Grace's arms tightened around her sleeping son. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "His name was William Will Adams. We married in Boston last year against my parents' wishes. They disowned me." The memory still stung. "Will had business to conclude before we could head west together. He sent me ahead with the promise to follow within a month. But he never came," Flynn guessed. Grace nodded, blinking back tears. "His last letter arrived just before Samuel was born. He wrote that he'd be on the next train west." She swallowed hard. "That was over 6 months ago. Have you tried to locate him?" "How could I? I have no money, no connections. I don't even know if he's alive." The tears she'd been fighting spilled over. "I keep telling myself that something must have happened to prevent him from coming, that he wouldn't abandon us willingly." Flynn was quiet for a long moment. "I could make inquiries," he finally offered. "I have contacts back east." Hope flickered in Grace's heart, quickly tempered by caution. "Why would you do that?" Flynn's gaze moved from her face to the sleeping child in her arms. "Because every boy deserves to know who his father is, even if that man turns out to be a disappointment." Something in his tone suggested personal experience, but Grace didn't press. "Thank you," she said simply. Flynn nodded, then rose from his chair. "It's getting chilly, you should take Samuel inside." As he turned to go, Grace called after him. "Flynn, the people in town, do they believe your story?" A wry smile touched his lips. "Some do, some don't. But no one's likely to challenge me openly, especially not after what happened with the Anderson brothers yesterday." "The Anderson brothers?" Flynn's expression darkened. "They made some unsavory remarks about you at the saloon. I explained why that was unacceptable. Grace's eyes widened. You fought them? Let's just say they now understand the importance of respecting a lady's reputation. Flynn tipped his hat. Good night, Grace. As he walked away, Grace realized that Flynn Grayson was far more complex than she had initially assumed. He was not merely a successful rancher with a charitable streak. He was a man willing to put himself at risk physically and socially to protect a woman and child who were, by all rights, nothing to him. The mystery of Flynn's motivation deepened over the following weeks, as summer gave way to early autumn. Grace settled into life at the Double G, helping Francis with household management and even assisting Consuela in the kitchen. Samuel thrived under the attention of his grandmother and the ranch hands who had quickly grown fond of the cheerful baby. Flynn remained something of an enigma. He was unfailingly kind but maintained a certain reserve, as if afraid to become too attached to either Grace or Samuel. Yet Grace often caught him watching the baby with an expression of wistfulness that tugged at her heart. One crisp September morning, Grace was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up, she saw Flynn riding in with several of his men, returning from a trip to check on a distant section of the ranch. Flynn dismounted with his usual fluid grace, but as he turned toward the house, Grace noticed a darkening bruise on his jaw and a torn sleeve. What happened? She asked, abandoning the laundry to hurry toward him. Flynn grimaced. Had a disagreement with Jeb Turner about property lines, nothing serious. It looks serious, Grace countered, reaching up without thinking to touch the bruise. Flynn flinched slightly, not from pain but from the unexpected contact. Sorry, she murmured, quickly withdrawing her hand. It's fine, Flynn assured her. Where's Samuel? Taking his morning nap. Your mother's watching him. Grace studied Flynn's face. Jeb Turner is one of Elmer Jenkins' friends, isn't he? Was this really about property lines? Flynn sighed. Turner took exception to my living in sin with a fallen woman, as he put it. I took exception to his choice of words. Grace felt a familiar mixture of guilt and gratitude wash over her. This has to stop, Flynn. You can't keep fighting my battles. There are battles now, Flynn replied quietly. Like it or not, we're in this together. Before Grace could respond, Frances appeared on the porch, Samuel in her arms. Flynn Grayson, have you been brawling again? She called, her tone managing to be both disapproving and fond. Flynn grinned sheepishly. Just a minor disagreement, Mother. Frances shook her head. Well, come inside and let Grace tend to that jaw. Consuela's made biscuits. As Grace followed Flynn into the house, she couldn't help noticing how easily they had all slipped into the roles of a family. Frances doted on Samuel as if he were truly her grandson. The ranch hands treated Grace with the respect due to their boss's wife. And Flynn protected them as fiercely as if they were truly his own. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. What would happen if Will Adams finally appeared? Or worse, what if they discovered he never would? That evening, after Samuel was asleep and Frances had retired to her room, Grace found Flynn in his study. He was seated at his desk, a glass of whiskey at his elbow as he pored over a letter. May I come in? Grace asked from the doorway. Flynn looked up, surprise evident on his face. Of course. Grace entered the warmly lit room, taking in the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable leather furniture. I wanted to thank you for today, for every day, really. Flynn set aside the letter. You don't need to thank me, Grace. I do. She took a seat in the chair opposite his desk. Few men would do what you've done for a stranger and her child. You're hardly strangers anymore, Flynn pointed out. He hesitated, then pushed the letter toward her. This came today, from my contact in Boston. Grace's heart began to race. About Will, Flynn nodded, his expression grave. I'm afraid the news isn't good. With trembling fingers, Grace picked up the letter. As she read, the blood drained from her face. William Adams had indeed left Boston, but not to join his wife. He had departed for Europe in the company of a wealthy widow, leaving behind considerable debts and at least 2 other women who claimed he had promised them marriage. He never intended to follow me west, Grace whispered, the painful truth finally clear. It was all a lie. Flynn reached across the desk to take her hand. I'm sorry, Grace. A sob escaped her as the full weight of Will's betrayal crashed down upon her. All these months, she had clung to the hope that some misfortune had prevented him from joining them. To learn that he had simply abandoned them, had likely never intended to do otherwise, was devastating. Samuel, she choked out. He'll grow up without a father. He'll face the very ridicule I've been trying to protect him from. Flynn tightened his grip on her hand. No, he won't. Grace looked up through her tears, confused. I meant what I said that day in town, Flynn continued. As far as anyone around here is concerned, Samuel bears my name. That doesn't have to change. But it would mean continuing as we are, Flynn finished for her. You staying here, us presenting ourselves as a family. Grace stared at him, trying to comprehend what he was suggesting. That's asking too much of you. Is it? Flynn released her hand and stood, moving around the desk to kneel beside her chair. Grace, these past weeks with you and Samuel here, the ranch has felt like a home for the first time in years. What are you saying? Grace whispered, hardly daring to hope she understood his meaning. Flynn took a deep breath. I'm saying that what began as a deception doesn't have to remain one. I care for you, Grace, more than I expected to, and I love that boy as if he were my own. Flynn, let me finish, he urged gently. I know you don't feel the same way. You've been betrayed by the man you loved and your heart is still healing. I'm not asking for your love, not yet. But I am asking for a chance to earn it. Grace's mind whirled with the implications of what he was proposing. You want us to marry? For real? Flynn nodded. Samuel would have my name legally, not just in the eyes of the town. You would have security and position, and perhaps in time. You would raise another man's child as your own? Grace asked, still struggling to believe his offer. I already think of him as mine, Flynn admitted, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. When I hold him, when I see him smile, it doesn't matter whose blood runs in his veins. Grace was silent for a long moment, studying the face of the man before her. Flynn Grayson was handsome, yes, but it was his integrity, his kindness, and his strength that had gradually captured her attention over these weeks together. She hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge the growing attraction, still bound by loyalty to a husband who, she now knew, had never deserved it. I can't promise to love you immediately, she finally said, but I do respect you, admire you. And I'm not blind to your feelings for Samuel or to the way my heart beats faster when you enter a room. Hope kindled in Flynn's eyes. Is that a yes? It's a yes, Grace confirmed, a tentative smile forming through her tears. I would be honored to become your wife, Flynn Grayson, for real this time. Flynn's answering smile was radiant. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Grace responded with a warmth that surprised them both, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. When they parted, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. We'll be married properly by Reverend Clark. No more whispers, no more doubts. What about your mother? Grace asked suddenly. Will she mind? Flynn chuckled. Mind? She's been plotting this outcome since the day we arrived. I suspect she'll have the wedding planned before breakfast. Grace laughed softly, feeling lighter than she had in months. The pain of Will's betrayal was still fresh, but it was tempered by the promise of a new beginning with a man who had proven his worth not through words, but through unwavering actions. True to Flynn's prediction, Frances was ecstatic when they announced their intention to marry. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the Willow Creek church, attended by the ranch hands and a select few townspeople who had shown kindness to Grace during her difficult months there. The ceremony was simple, but meaningful. Samuel, resplendent in a new outfit sewn by Frances, cooed happily in his grandmother's arms as Grace and Flynn exchanged vows. When Reverend Clark pronounced them husband and wife, Flynn's kiss held a promise that made Grace's cheeks flush with anticipation. The reception at the Double G was a joyous affair, with music, dancing, and more food than even the hungry ranch hands could consume. As the celebration continued into the evening, Grace found herself watching Flynn as he moved among the guests, his natural charm and easy authority evident in every interaction. "He's a good man," Frances said, appearing beside Grace with a sleeping Samuel in her arms. "The best I know." "Yes, he is," Grace agreed softly. "You know," Frances continued, her eyes twinkling, "when Flynn first brought you home that day, I thought he'd finally lost his mind, but then I saw the way he looked at this little one." She glanced down at Samuel. "And later the way he looked at you when he thought no one was watching." Grace smiled. "He saved us in every way possible." "Perhaps," Frances allowed, "but you've saved him too, my dear. After his father died, Flynn poured everything into building this ranch. Success came, but at a cost. He forgot how to live beyond his work." She patted Grace's hand. "Until you—" Before Grace could respond, Flynn approached, his expression warm as he gazed at his new family. "Mother, I believe you've monopolized my wife and son long enough," Frances laughed. "Nonsense. I'm simply enjoying my grandson while I can, but I suppose I should let you two have a dance before the evening's over." She kissed Grace's cheek. "I'll put this little one to bed." As Frances departed with Samuel, Flynn drew Grace into his arms. "Happy, Mrs. Grayson?" "Very," Grace assured him, allowing herself to be led onto the makeshift dance floor. "Though I'm still getting used to the name." "It suits you," Flynn murmured, pulling her closer as they began to move to the music. "Almost as well as motherhood suits you." Grace rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I've been thinking about that." "Oh, Samuel deserves siblings," she said softly. "A brother or sister to grow up with." Flynn's steps faltered momentarily. "Are you saying not yet?" Grace clarified with a smile. "But someday soon, perhaps." The look of joy that spread across Flynn's face was answer enough. As they continued to dance under the starlit Montana sky, surrounded by friends and well-wishers, Grace marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate young woman with a fatherless child, facing scorn and danger in a frontier town. Now she was the wife of a man who had claimed her son as his own, not out of obligation but out of love. A man who had seen past society's judgment to the truth of her heart. "What are you thinking about?" Flynn asked, noting her contemplative expression. Grace looked up at him, her heart full. "About how a single moment of courage can change everything. When you stood up in that street and said Samuel bears your name, you changed both our lives forever." Flynn's arms tightened around her. "Best decision I ever made." As the music swelled around them, Grace rose on tiptoe to kiss her husband, no longer caring who might be watching. The whispers that had once condemned her now spoke of the Grayson family's obvious happiness, of the rancher who had claimed a fatherless child as his own, and of the love that had transformed a protective lie into an enduring truth. Samuel Adams Grayson would grow up knowing only that his father had chosen him, had fought for him, had loved him from the first moment they met. And someday, when he was old enough to understand, Grace would tell him the story of the brave cowboy who had given him not just a name, but a legacy of courage, honor, and unconditional love.